Hi, my name is Rebekah Simon-Peter, and I'm the author of Forging a New Path, Moving the Church Forward in a Post-Pandemic World. And I am so excited to be with you at the 2023 Interim Ministry Network Annual Conference. When I started to research Forging a New Path, I realized that people were asking three big questions. When do things go back to normal? How do we get people to church or back to church? And how do we do more with less? And as you know, the world changed overnight in March 2020. Communities and countries shut down. And first there were waves of death, and then there were waves of variants, and then there were waves of conflict over masks and vaccines and politics and government. And some of that chaos is still with us, even intensified. But, even now, long after the shutdowns are over and most of us have put our masks away, we found things aren't back to normal yet. And people are still asking the questions. How do we deal with this new normal? How do we get people to reconnect with faith and faith communities? How do we make do with what we have? And even as we here at the annual conference are talking about engaging new ways and seeking new paths and finding the new hope that God has for us, I still believe we can learn from the past. It turns out there's a lot to learn from the bubonic plague and the 300-year pandemic that swept through medieval Europe starting in the 14th century. I did a lot of research on that for Forging a New Path. And here's what I discovered about the present from looking at pandemics past. Starting with those questions, when do things go back to normal? Well, they don't. They didn't go back to normal in medieval Europe, just like they're not going back to normal now. But back then, half the population died off. And when parish records indicated that 30 people in the parish had died in any given week, that's when archery contests were shut down, theaters were shut down, feasts were put on hold. But people thought that in the worship of God, they would be safe because they kind of thought the whole plague thing was from God anyway. They thought they'd be safe and protected, but they weren't. Just like we found with some congregations that continued to meet during the pandemic, half the priests died off back then, and people had to find their own way to God. The spiritual but not religious movement, which I thought started sometime in the last several decades, I realized in my research actually started way back then, when priests weren't available. People had to take spirituality and spiritual matters into their own hands. And when priests weren't available, at least you could always call on the saints. So laity movements started, and movements that were decentralized, that didn't depend on the clergy so much as on the community itself and their spiritual journey. Now, much of this focus on the laity was good and interesting and innovative, but not all of it was admirable. Just as during COVID-19, Asians were blamed and subject to persecution, there was a lot of violence against Asians. Same thing with the Jews back then. They were blamed for the bubonic plague or the Black Death. And this scapegoating resulted in terrible persecution and much suffering. In fact, I write about that in my book, The Jew Named Jesus. I'm born and raised Jewish, later had an experience of Jesus. This little aside, wound up in a clergy position in the United Methodist Church, but I have a deep heart and connection with both sides of my identity. Now, these days, the spiritual but not religious have been telling us that something is missing for them. I mean, back then it was clergy and whole structures that just were decimated by the bubonic plague. But here they've been telling us that something's missing in the way we gather and what it is we do when we are together. Turns out they want more spirituality, more miracles, more presence of God, more direct connection in the heart, not so much head, more heart, more hope that's relevant and real. So when we're asking the question, when do things go back to normal? Maybe it's time to learn from the spiritual but not religious and declare, you've already been telling us, people, spirituality is the next normal. And I believe that with all my heart. Spirituality is the next normal for us. It's time for us to see things in a new way and engage in a new way. Well, the second question that people have been asking is, how do we get people to church or back to church or synagogue? Fill in the blank, whatever your community of faith is called. It's the same sort of question. Well, if we look at the bubonic plague, we find, you know what? They had this question too. And the truth was, there wasn't really a church to invite people back to. Think about it. Half the clergy are gone. half your people are gone. The structures that you've counted on are gone. The stability that those structures provided are gone. The sense of well-being, the sense of faith that's built on those stable structures, gone. Gone. The plague decimated more than individual lives. It decimated a whole way of being. So in medieval times, in order to go forward, people had to be invited into something brand new. Now, if you've ever given birth, you know it's a messy process. This was no less messy. Ultimately, the Protestant Reformation, the Wesleyan movement, all of that was an outcome of the plague. So there was something new to invite people to. Now, this question, how do we get people to church or back to church? I got to say, begins with a faulty assumption. It begins with the assumption that what we were doing before the pandemic, before March 2020, was sufficient. But I want you to think back to, January 2020 or July 2022, July 2019. People were already quiet quitting. They were already leaving the pews, leaving their plates at the potlucks and never coming back for them. They were quiet quitting church and synagogue decades before the pandemic hit. We were already in rough shape when the shutdowns happened. And we have to acknowledge that the question of how to get people back to church is not a new one. How to get people back to Friday night services, not a new one. It's one we've been asking for years. The spiritual but not religious have been letting us know they're not satisfied, and they're the ones that have been leaving. People are looking for something more. So it's time to invite people to something new. We don't have the Protestant Reformation right now or the equivalents, but we do have something so needed: spiritual community. All right, question 3, people have been asking, how do we do more with less? Well, in medieval times, as the plagues swept through wave after wave after wave across Europe, folks had a lot less of a lot of things. A lot less of a lot of things. We're going to dive into this when we're together. But they also had more of some unexpected things. And they learned to ask, with that surplus of unexpected things, what can we now do that we couldn't do before? We couldn't even have imagined doing before. Well, it turns out a lot. Their surpluses led to surprising innovations. Just as the losses led to surprising innovations, so did the surpluses. Now, we got a new technology during our pandemic. We got Zoom, right? I'm on it right now making this recording. We're going to be meeting on it later. But they got the book, the printing press. And you know what that meant? Controversial ideas, controversial people. Well, controversial ideas could no longer be burned at the stake. You could burn a person at the stake, but not their ideas. Their ideas lived on in print. The ideas lived on in print, and dissent and discussion became active dynamics of society, and the world changed radically, radically. Now, we too have less of some things, and we've got more of other things. This too is a time of great innovation if we will wrestle with the chaos enough to let that innovation come forth, especially when we ask a new question. What can we now do that we couldn't do before? When we look at these 3 questions, when do things go back to normal? How do we get people back to church? How do we do more with less? When we look at these 3 questions and the answers that arose from them, you can see that spirituality is a common theme. It's an underlying denominator for these questions. And that's good, because for people of faith, for God people, for people who care about religion, for people who care about faith-based community, for people who care about spirituality, it's important, because spirituality is about getting back to basics. Now, that actually leads us to another topic that I'm going to be speaking on at the annual conference. How to do more with less is Wednesday. Thursday is the 3 S's of post-pandemic community. So you know already, and I know, but let me just say it. We live in one of the loneliest times in human history. We have more people on the planet than we've ever had before. We have more ways to connect than we've ever had before. And yet we are more disconnected than we've ever been before. What we're missing is a deep sense of belonging, of community. Now, community is more than coffee Community is more than coffee hour after church or kiddish after Friday night services or fellowship between services. Community is about connecting at a deep level by getting to the heart of who we are as social beings, as spiritual beings, as communal beings. So it's time to look at a new model of community that I proffer here for faith-based congregations, and that's the 3 S's of post-pandemic community. You want to know what they are? Being social, being spiritual, and being of service. Now, this model is both ancient and new. It resonates deeply with the spiritual but not religious, with millennials, with Gen X, and it's aligned with biblical principles and traditions of times past. If you look at very successful communities, very successful spiritual but not religious communities like Alcoholics Anonymous, it's 80 years old now, you can see that these 3 elements are woven together into the life of those communities. I mean, they spend social time together. They have to put away old friends and move on from old playmates and playpens, as they put it in those meetings. And that means leaving the old social life behind. And so they spend a lot of time cultivating new friendships, new connections. They're deeply focused on the spiritual path. After all, the whole purpose or the ultimate goal of the 12 steps is to have a spiritual awakening. And then they're deeply oriented towards being of service because they have a spiritual awakening in order to carry the message to the newcomer. So their call is to help the newcomer, the person still drinking, and they become people who are of service at a very great level to families and communities. So they hang together through these 3 components of community. And I think it's time for the church to learn from them. Being social, being spiritual, and being of service. Now, true confession, one of many that will come your way from me. When I was actively pastoring churches, I did that for about 12 years in the Denver and Wyoming area. I didn't used to think that being social at church was all that important. In fact, I thought it was a detractor from our real purpose. You know, we have wrongs to right. We have injustices to undo. We have a world to save. But the pandemic really changed my mind on this. Not that we don't have wrongs to right and injustices to undo and a world to love, but I got to tell you, I really missed people. I missed people when the doors of the church were shut and the doors of the restaurants and the doors of the grocery store and the doors of family members were shut. I missed people. Now, given I am an extrovert, you may be an introvert and you may have thought, oh my gosh, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. But this extrovert, oh man, I missed people. I really missed people. And now I think being social is absolutely essential to what it means, not just to be a human, but to be part of a community of faith. Because it's so much a part of personal well-being. It's so much a part of mental health. It's so much a part of communal well-being. Being social is a resilient glue that holds us together. And here's why I think it's so very important for communities of faith. Because if we aren't social together, and I can't believe I'm making this argument given where I've come from, but here we go. If we aren't being really social together, can we really be spiritual together? Really? Can we really link arms and be of service together if we're not actually connected by the ties of knowing one another, loving one another, appreciating one another, knowing something about one another? I work a lot in leadership development in churches. I have a program called Creating a Culture of Renewal that I've been doing for the last 12, 13 years, which is all about helping church leaders dream like Jesus and become agents of transformation in their congregations. And it just occurs to me as I've been doing that leadership development work that being social, lack of being social and being connected in the church is probably one of the biggest breakdowns for why the church can't generate a breakthrough for itself, because people don't really know each other. And so they really want to serve together side by side and do the intimate work of spiritual life together. And it is intimate to do that together. So Jesus and his people hung out for 3 years. That made them effective. I think us getting to know each other can help us be a lot more effective too. So this is good news for church, good news for synagogue, because we already have so many ways of being social together that it's inherent in our congregational life. We have worship, we have Bible studies, we have book studies, we have coffee hour, we have service projects, we have affinity groups. And so that means that we're able to make use of a hidden superpower that's there, and that's weak social ties. Weak social ties. Now, you may wonder, what the heck are weak social ties? And it doesn't even sound that good. Like, why is that a superpower? Well, let me say what weak social tie is by telling you first what a strong social tie is. A strong social tie is somebody you know well. You interact with them regularly, maybe in person, maybe on the phone, maybe social media. You've got their phone number in your phone, and you could call them in the middle of the night. You may not call them in the middle of the night, but you know that if you needed to, you could. This is family. This is close friends. These are maybe somebody that you work with. So this is somebody that you know really well. Now, some people only have one strong social tie. One strong social tie. Some people don't have any. Some people have several, maybe even a lot of them. So you might think strong social tie, that's really what's needed here. Especially when you compare it with weak social ties, which are actually more tenuous. These are folks you see in a certain setting, but you don't necessarily know a lot about them. You recognize each other, you say hello to each other, you smile, it's good to see each other. Could be the barista or the bus driver, or the people that come to church once a year. Now, church is important to them. They come once a year, or they come to the high holy days, and they're important to the congregation. For the folks in the pews, these weak social ties are incredibly important, because it turns out that the more places one belongs, the more communities one can say they are a part of, the stronger their measure of mental health and physical well-being and longevity. The longer you live, the more places you're connected, the longer you live. Weak social ties actually provide that needed connection. And weak social ties are just as important, if not more important, than strong social ties. Now, isn't that interesting? And again, this is where communities of faith can really capitalize. We can excel because we're so good at this. We have so many of this already built in. So the 3 S's of post-pandemic community: being social. You heard it from me, the previous non-social person. Not non-social, not antisocial, just like that's not important in faith community. Back to front and center, being social. That's the first one. The second S, being spiritual. Now, spirituality is a word we use a lot. I use it a lot, but what does it actually mean? I love this definition of spirituality from a respected tome of theological wisdom called Spirituality for Dummies by Sharon Janis. Here's what Sharon has to say. Spirituality realigns your sense of self to something you may not have even ever imagined was within you. Spirituality says that even if you think you're limited and small, it simply isn't so. You're greater and more powerful than you have ever imagined. A great and divine light exists inside of you. This same light is also inside everyone you know and in everyone you will ever know in the future. You may think you're limited to just your physical body and state of affairs, including your gender, race, family, job, status in life. But spirituality comes in and says, there is more than this. There is more than this. End quote. There is more than this. And we know it. Because at the heart of church, at the heart of synagogue, at the heart of religion, of the Torah, of the Bible, is spirituality. That great and divine light of being, not doing. The God of the Bible, whether Torah or New Testament, is a God of direct encounters. And that's what those chapters, those pages are reflecting. Being one with God, of sensing that the Spirit within us, that divine light and life within us, that's spirituality. And when we're guided by this wisdom, then we know we're okay. Now, most religions have a mystical branch, right? And That's where you could say spirituality resides. But many, many people who come to the community of faith on a weekly basis or a monthly basis don't have to want to join the mystical club to get the good stuff. They want that front and center. Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday morning, they want that front and center. How do we know this? It's interesting to note that even as religious affiliation has sharply dropped over the years, spiritual affiliation has skyrocketed. People want this. People want this. So rather than fearing or dismissing the message that the spiritual but not religious communicate by leaving your congregation, by getting up from the pew and not even bothering to pick up the pie plate from the potluck, why not learn from them instead? They're signaling the need for a shift in religious culture that we can all benefit from. In fact, in my book, Forging a New Path, I write about James Fowler's stages of faith development and how you can look and see that the spiritual but not religious is one of those stages in there of normal, healthy faith development. And if we could loosen up the strictures and the structures such that as people are passing through that normal stage of faith development, they don't feel like they're getting squeezed out and they can stay in our communities of faith because there's space for their questioning and space for the opposites that come to pass. Wouldn't that be a miracle? Something of a modern miracle. I believe that it's really possible for us to re-envision and reimagine our faith communities in such a way that people can naturally pass through the stages of faith, natural faith development, remain in the congregations, and grow, even as they feel the paradox of head and heart, science and spirit, logic and intuition. That's what I really believe is possible. So as we pay attention to what the spiritual but not religious are telling us, it's like we're hearing from members of our congregation that felt they couldn't stay, but they still like to speak to us about what would actually work for them and how we can reimagine, re-envision, re-expand our congregations of faith to include not only the religious, but the spiritual. As we pay attention, I think we're going to find that the news is generally hopeful. Now, the third S of the three S's of post-pandemic community. Let's have a little quiz here. Being social, yes. Being spiritual, you got it. And being of service. That's our third S. Well, quite often we think of service as a one-way flow of help. I got something, you need it. I have plenty, you're needy. You have a need, I'm going to fulfill it. But I don't know. I think this does a disservice to both the giver and the receiver. Because by simply giving to the needy or the less fortunate and always having that be a one-way flow, that keeps things hierarchical, colonial, and it keeps people in a victim mode. And it's not exactly really respecting imago Dei, the image of God within each of us. Now, I'm not saying people don't have needs and that whoever the we is, can't help fulfill it. But when it's just a one-way flow of help, that's sort of patronizing for people. And it's diminishing for the giver. So I would like to suggest that part of the community sense that is needed now is mutuality, a sense that we're all in this together. That means giving and receiving, learning from as well as bringing to. Years ago, one of my mentors taught me this. Now, at the time, she looked like a student, but I look in retrospect and I realized she was a mentor. She taught me as we were preparing to do a service project at the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. She said, don't think you're doing any big saving or rescuing here. She said, instead, go to learn from them. We don't want people to come that are just out to save and rescue. And she told me, she's not Native, but she told me that when people leave from those, quote, mission trips, the people that were recipients of the mission, I said, yes, was, the fourth time I got my house painted in 3 years, or, that there's this constant flow, but nobody was coming to learn from them. So she said, instead, go to learn from them. Now, that's a gift. That's a gift. People who feel invisible, people are made to seem invisible. Go and learn. Go and listen. That's a huge gift. Yes, you can bring gifts when you go, but let it be a mutual exchange instead of a one-way flow of help. I think that brings new light to love your neighbor as yourself. So I'm going to challenge you to find ways to be of service that increase the sense of light in the other. that increases a sense of agency, that increases the dignity, the humanity of all involved. Being social, being spiritual, being of service. The 3 S's of post-pandemic community. Now, bonus points for finding ways to bring them all together in one lovely experience. We'll talk about that when we're together at the annual conference. Here's my last word for you. We are in a transitional moment. We're in a transitional moment in our society, in our congregations, in our families, in our world, in our democracy, and what it means to be a civil person and a person of faith. The past is over. The new is emerging, but it's messy, and there's a lot of chaos with it, and it's hard for people. Even people who welcome change find the chaos disconcerting. Things are confusing. Yeah, things are tough in the world, but guess what that means? This is your time. You transitional ministers, you interim ministers, you intentional bridgers of the gap. This is your moment. This is what you're made for. And this is what we'll be discussing when we're together. If we keep asking the same questions, we're going to get some version of the same answer. But as we ask new questions, as we explore new paths, as we're open to new wisdom, sing new songs, new directions will be revealed and new possibilities will arise. I so look forward to being with you as we further explore the new hope that God is bringing to each of us. Thanks be to God. I look forward to seeing you soon.